very brief bio to Mosby. So he's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Master University's Institute for Canadian History. His first book, Food Will Win the War, The Politics, Culture, and Science of Food on Canada's Homecoming, was published by UBC Press in 2014. And it was awarded the Canadian Historical Association's 215 Political History Book Prize, not too shabby. His research uncovering a series of government-sponsored nutrition experiments conducted primarily on children attending Canada's notorious Indian residential schools received widespread national and international media attention. His current research explores the interconnected histories of science, health, and colonialism. So before I ask Dr. Mosby to come to the mic and start his presentation, I just want to tell people that there will be a counselor in the crowd for people who have maybe gone through the terrible experience of residential school, and if there are triggers, then I will ask you to raise your hand. The counselor right at the back there. So she will be here for people needing assistance. So welcome, Katrina 6.
So, thank you so much for being here tonight. I just want to say what an honor it is to be a guest on Treaty 6 territory today. The last time I was here was I was 4 years old, and all I remember was that there's a wave pool in Saskatoon. And it's a lot more beautiful than I remember. I also really want to thank both Jim Clifford and Erica Dick for inviting me to speak today. The University of Saskatchewan's Departments of History and Indigenous Studies for sponsoring this event, and for Station 20 West for being such a wonderful host and for making such amazing food. That's really wonderful. If you haven't had any, I highly, highly recommend it. And finally, I want to thank this is an amazing crowd of people to come on a Monday night to hear about some a difficult topic. And so I really want to thank you for coming. And I want to encourage you at any time to stop me and ask me questions. And if not, I'm happy to answer as many questions people have at the end of the talk. So I've been invited today to discuss the legacy of a series of nutrition experiments conducted by the Canadian government and in 6 residential schools across the country between 1948 and 1952. But I actually thought that I would start my presentation today in the fall of 1965, when the Indian Affairs branch of the Department of Citizenship and Immigration asked a number of its Indigenous employees to reflect upon their experiences as being former residential school students. One of these employees was Russell Moses, an Air Force veteran and a member of the Delaware Band of the Six Nations of Grand River. I'll show you a picture here of Russell Moses as a child, as a reminder that all I'm going to be talking about today happened to children. And it's important to always keep this in mind when thinking about residential schools. And between 1942 and 1947, Moses had attended the notorious Mohawk Institute, or the Mush Hole, as was commonly known to Moses and others who survived it. Now, Moses was blunt in his assessment of his residential school experience. When I was asked to do these papers, I had some misgivings, he wrote. For if I were to be honest and tell things as they actually were. And really, he added, this is not my story, but yours. And the story he tells in this document is a harrowing one of constant abuse and mistreatment of the worst kind. And food turns out to be central to the abuse that Moses suffered in the mush hole, and therefore plays a prominent role in his report. And I should add that this report was first brought to my attention by Moses' son, John Moses, and I'm citing from his family's permission. The food at the Institute, Moses wrote, was disgraceful. And I'm quoting from his memoir here. For breakfast, students were given 2 slices of bread with either jam or honey as dressing, oatmeal with worms, or cornmeal porridge, which was minimal in quantity and appalling in quality. The beverage, he added, consisted of skim milk, and when one stops to consider that we were milking from 20 to 30 head of purebred Holstein cattle, it seems odd that we did not ever receive whole milk. And in my 5 years at the Institute, we never once received butter. Lunch, as it turned out, was no better. And I quote, "At the Institute, this consisted of water as a beverage. If you were a senior boy or girl, you received 1.5 slices of dry bread, and the main course consisted of a rotten soup made of scraps of beef and vegetables, some in a state of decay. Children under the grade 5 level, for their part, received 1 slice of dry bread. Incidentally," he added, "we were not Weight Watchers." And finally, for supper, Moses recalled, "This consisted of 2 slices of bread and jam, fried potatoes, no meat, a bun baked by the girls, and every other night a piece of cake or possibly an apple in the summer months." The diet remained constant, Moses wrote, and hunger was never absent. He estimated that 90% of the children were suffering from some form of malnutrition, and he even recalled, quote, "children eating from the swill barrel, picking out soggy bits of food that was intended for pigs." Now, one reason I've chosen to start my presentation today was the work of someone who wasn't even part of these nutrition experiments. As the Mohawk Institute was initially chosen to be part of the experiments, but was eventually not included, because I want to highlight the fact that hunger and malnutrition were never limited to the 6 schools that these experiments took place in. In fact, according to the final report of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's clear that during the 1940s and 1950s, the period I'll be discussing today, many residential school students, quote, "went hungry and were fed meals that led to serious deficiencies in vitamins and minerals." And as a residential school survivor who wrote to me about their own experience during the 1940s, quote, "even today, I still cannot ease my feelings of hunger." And so it's always important, I think, to start any talk about these malnutrition, these nutrition experiments, by stressing that these experiments were only made possible because malnutrition was endemic in residential schools across the country. And not just in the Alberni, the Blood, St. Paul's, St. Mary's, Cecilia Jeffrey, and Shubenacadie schools where the nutrition experiments took place. Now, my research on these nutrition experiments first began to be reported by the media in the summer of 2013. Canadians seemed to be rightfully outraged. The experiments became front-page headlines from coast to coast, and I heard the same questions from friends, neighbors, and even total strangers. How could our government have done this? How could scientists abuse children as guinea pigs, especially after the atrocities committed by Nazi doctors came to light in the 1940s? And why hadn't we known about this before? And many of these, I think, were the right questions to ask, and I still don't think these questions have been sufficiently answered, particularly by the federal government or by the churches that ran these schools. And so the goal of my talk today is to try to answer some of these and other questions to the best of my ability by looking at these nutrition experiments within a broader historical context. And this is because I think contextualizing these experiments is of fundamental importance. Not only do we get a unique window into the mindset of the bureaucrats who ran the Indian Affairs Department and the Indian residential school system, but it also suggests the ways in which health crises facing Indigenous communities have too often been seen as an opportunity for research rather than as something in need of immediate and coordinated government response. And this is where I think we can start to draw parallels between what happened in the 1940s and 1950s and what's happening today in Indigenous communities across the country. Now, I'm going to focus much of my talk today on residential schools, It's important to note that these experiments actually didn't originate in residential schools at all, but rather in northern Manitoba during the height of the Second World War. And this was a period that, as it turned out, in northern Manitoba was characterized by considerable food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition, as Indigenous peoples in the area became increasingly alienated from their traditional lands and resources in the face of a whole range of different ecological, demographic, economic, and political changes. And perhaps most importantly, this was a period that came after more than 2 decades of cutbacks in government spending on emergency food relief to Indigenous peoples, as well as the near collapse of the fur trade economy following the loss of European export markets during the Great Depression and Second World War. So these communities were hit particularly hard by both the Depression and the war. And so it's in this depressed economic context that a group of scientific and medical researchers, these men here, set off on a March 1942 expedition to a number of Cree First Nations. The team included such figures as Dr. Percy Moore, the Superintendent of Medical Services for Canada's Federal Indian Affairs Branch, and Dr. Frederick Tisdall, Canada's leading nutrition expert and the co-inventor of the infant food pathway. Almost immediately upon arriving in the communities of Norway House, Cross Lake, God's Lake Mine, Rossville, and the Pas, the research team was confronted with widespread and often readily visible signs of malnutrition. At both Norway House and Cross Lake, for instance, the team reported that, quote, while most of the people were going about trying to make a living, they were really sick enough to be in bed under treatment, and that if they were white people, they'd be in bed demanding care and medical attention. They also found that many elderly residents were, quote, almost starved and were plainly not getting enough food to enable them to do much more than keep alive. Now, the political leaders of the First Nations visited by the research team were well aware of what the causes of the malnutrition in their community were, and attributed them directly to both government policies as well as sharp declines in game populations, coupled with the broader wartime economic crisis facing fur trade communities. The researchers didn't really listen to the communities themselves. They agreed that these communities were facing a malnutrition crisis, but they felt nothing could be done until they had a chance to study the problem further. As Percy Moore would tell a House of Commons special committee in May 1944, quote, as a result of the survey, one of the first steps considered necessary in any program to improve the health of the Indian through better nutrition was to demonstrate whether provision of food or some of the food substances or food factors found to be lacking in their diet would result in immediate improvement in their health. What this meant in plain language, though, was that rather than calling for immediate assistance in the form of more generous relief, food assistance, or increased medical care, for a community that, according to Moore himself, had an estimated average food consumption of under 1,500 calories per person. Basically, starvation levels for people who were trying to work and make a living hunting and trapping. Instead, Moore, Tisdall, and the rest of the research team set out organizing a scientific experiment on the effectiveness of vitamin supplements. The study, they argued, would not only provide greater insight into the best ways of improving the nutritional status of First Nations across the country, but would also allow them to test their broader hypothesis that, quote, many characteristics such as shiftlessness, indolence, improvidence, and inertia, so long regarded as inherent or hereditary traits in the Indian race, may really at root be the manifestations of malnutrition. So nutrition, in other words, offered a possible solution to the quote-unquote Indian problems of disease and dependency that had for so long preoccupied Canadian bureaucrats, politicians, and intellectuals. And this March 1942 expedition ultimately spurred over the next decade an unprecedented series of nutritional studies of subarctic First Nations, as well as residential schools. The first of these began in 1942 and saw roughly 300 malnourished members of the Norway House and Cross Lake Cree First Nations being used as experimental subjects in a study on the effectiveness of a range of different vitamin supplements in the treatment of acute nutritional deficiencies. The study saw roughly half of the group being used as controls, meaning that they were given no interventions in their diet, no improvements to their diet, and the other half being provided with various kinds of vitamin supplements. It's worth remembering that they found that the people were hungry. They lacked enough calories to stay alive, and yet they decided to test the effectiveness of vitamin supplements. This was followed by a much larger 1947-1948 James Bay study under the leadership of Frederick Tisdall, Percy Moore, and the University of Toronto anthropologist G. Gordon Brown. Utilizing a team of 12 researchers, including 6 physicians, a dentist, an X-ray technician, a photographer, and 3 anthropologists, the study examined the James Bay Cree communities of Attawapiskat and Rupert's House in order to explore, quote, possible methods for augmenting or improving the food supplies of bush Indians. Now these studies, like many of the other studies being done at the time, were driven by 2 interrelated hypotheses that at the hands of government bureaucrats like Percy Moore would almost become self-fulfilling prophecies. The first of these was the already mentioned theory that nutrition might offer a possible solution to the quote-unquote Indian problem. But closely related to this was a theory that malnutrition in indigenous communities was not the result of decades of failed colonial policies and systematic discrimination, but instead was the result of what they believed was the inevitable and so-called natural transition from traditional to quote-unquote modern diets. Or, as a 1948 press release from Indian Affairs argued, quote, Canada's northern Indians have lost the art of eating. They've abandoned the native eating habits of their forefathers and adopted a semi-civilized, semi-native diet which lacks essential food values, brings them to malnutrition, and leaves them prey to tuberculosis and other disease. The white man, who unintentionally is responsible for the Indians' changed eating habits, is now trying to salvage the red man by directing him towards proper food channels. End quote. So as this press release seemed to suggest, the solution to the problem of malnutrition, and therefore the solution to the so-called Indian problem as well, was more expert intervention into indigenous people's diets and everyday lives. The James Bay study therefore sought to assess the possibility of achieving the kinds of cultural changes deemed necessary in order to quote-unquote modernize indigenous diets by employing a team of anthropologists whose stated goal was to provide insight into, and I'm not making this up, quote, how the Indian ticks. As Frederick Tisdall told a parliamentary committee in 1947, quote, we do not know as much as we should as to what motivates the Indian. The Indian is very different from us. We have to find out how the Indian can be encouraged, how his work can be diversified, his efforts diversified, so he can make himself self-supporting, so he can obtain the food he needs. But some of the researchers also sought more direct and technologically focused forms of intervention into the diets of indigenous peoples. Percy Moore in particular believed that nutritionally fortified foods combined with some sort of vitamin and mineral supplementation would offer the best and more importantly from Moore's perspective, cheapest means of transforming indigenous diets and preventing malnutrition. And this, it became clear, formed the key motivation behind the most ambitious and arguably most disturbing study of all, which under the leadership of this man, Dr. Lionel Bradley Pett, sought to examine the effects of expert intervention into the diets of nearly 1,000 indigenous students in 6 Indian residential schools over the course of 5 years. Although indigenous parents had been arguing for decades, the archives are filled with letters from parents who were arguing that their children were hungry and sick because of the poor quality of food being served, provided in residential schools. It was really only after a series of investigations by Red Cross and Nutrition Division dietitians during the 1940s that government officials both in and outside of Indian Affairs began to admit that the problem of malnutrition in residential schools was systemic in nature. And so these early investigations into the diets of residential school students found almost universally poor conditions in the schools that were visited. Nearly without exception, the schools failed to meet the government's basic stated requirements for vitamins, minerals, protein, and even calories. And most schools, children weren't allowed a second helping no matter how hungry they were, and especially given the fact that the same food was provided to children regardless of age. And so-called protective foods like meat, milk, fruits, and vegetables were a rarity. And one thing I should add is, as I was reading through these reports of the quality of diets in the schools, they also mentioned that they told the schools in advance they were coming. And so, in fact, these reports that show horrible conditions of the diets of the students were actually probably better than the actual conditions because they changed They switched it up in order to make themselves look better, and they still showed systemic malnutrition. The inspectors also found that in addition to serving insufficient quantities of food, schools often lacked a trained cooking staff. In some cases, the janitor was the cook because they couldn't actually pay a cook enough money to stay on. There was constant turnover of staff because the conditions in the schools were so poor. Most schools lacked rudimentary appliances, refrigeration, or even basic sanitation. Many schools didn't have proper running water, etc. down the line. But more important, though, is the fact that even if there was quality appliances, a trained cooking staff who understood the principles of nutrition, there really was rarely sufficient funds to actually purchase nutritious foods in these schools. It quickly became clear to investigators that this latter issue in particular was at the heart of the problem. Based on the Nutrition Division's own calculations, the per capita grant provided for food in most schools was often half that required to maintain a balanced and nutritionally adequate diet. And so Lionel Pett, the Nutrition Division Director, did make some early recommendations to improve the training of kitchen staff, improve the menus being used in residential schools in the aftermath of the survey, but he found that it was useless because they would train a new cook and then the cook would quit because the pay and the conditions were so poor. And so they did a number of follow-up surveys in 1947. They showed little or no improvement. And so it was at this point that Pett began planning for a long-term study that he argued would be, quote, designed to investigate certain questions already raised regarding Indians. These included questions like, are conditions observed in northern Manitoba found elsewhere in Canada? What type of food service in residential schools will economically provide the best maintenance of health and carry over desirable food habits to the reserve? And finally, will foods fortified with vitamins and minerals provide demonstrable results over the course of 5 years? Pett, in other words, wanted to examine the effects of malnutrition firsthand, and at the same time to assess the adaptability of indigenous diets that, according to Pett, were, quote, caught in a transition state between the fully adequate native diet and an adequate white man's diet. Pett quickly managed to gain the support of both the Department of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services for his plan. And in the fall of 1948, began a series of experiments that incorporated, among other things, medical and dental examinations, blood tests, intelligence and aptitude tests, as well as a collection of menus and dietary records from each of the schools. And so the specific experiments themselves included, one experiment was an examination of the impact of something called Newfoundland flour, which was essentially a flour fortified with artificial vitamins, minerals, and ground bone meal at the St. Mary's School in Kenora, Ontario, as well as a number of others. A double-blind randomized study of the effects of vitamin C supplementation on children with clinical vitamin C deficiencies at the Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia, meaning half the students were given placebos, no intervention, the other half were given vitamin C tablets. Another experiment was an examination of the effects of both inadequate and adequate milk consumption on a population of children with clinical signs of riboflavin deficiency at the Alberni School in British Columbia. An examination of something called Canada-approved vitamin B flour at the Blood Stool in southern Alberta. An experiment looking at the impact of a combination of intensive nutrition education and the provision of optional servings of whole wheat bread at the Cecilia Jeffers School in Kenora, Ontario. And finally, the St. Paul's School in Cardston, Alberta was chosen as a control school, meaning that no changes were made to its menus over the course of the study, despite the fact that the food served was found to be deficient in the supply of a whole range of vitamins and minerals. Now, on the surface, most of these studies seem to involve some therapeutic value. They're providing vitamins to the children. It's important to note that none of them address the broader range of nutritional deficiencies assessed at each school, which were wide-ranging and went beyond single vitamins. And instead, they focused on much more narrow, technologically based interventions that could be applied to the problem of malnutrition both on reserves and in residential schools alike. And in fact, in some cases, the researchers actively withheld certain treatments from students. For instance, when one of the lead researchers on the study, Dr. H.K. Brown, the head of the Federal Dental Division, he discovered that Indian Health Service dentists had actually visited some of the students in Kenora at St. Mary's and Cecilia Jeffries. And so he quickly sent off telegrams and letters insisting that for the duration of the study, quote, no specialized overall type of dental service should be provided to the students, such as these sodium fluoride or dental prophylaxis. Brown argued that because cavities and gingivitis were both, quote, important factors in assessing nutritional status, that any significant dental interventions would interfere with the results of the study. Now, the stated goal of these experiments was supposedly in the long term to improve the nutrition in residential schools around the country. But the experiments were also clearly designed to answer a number of questions of interest to PET, and a number of possible solutions to the so-called quote-unquote Indian problem more generally. Alberni Residential School Principal A.E. Caldwell, for his part, felt that the goal of the experiment was consistent with what he viewed as the goal of residential schooling, and this quote I'm going to read is riddled with grammatical and spelling errors, which is also a statement on the quality of education being provided in these schools. The principal himself was semi-literate. Constructive teaching in the residential school, he wrote, will lead the Indian people away from indolent habits inherent in the race because of their hitherto easy means of sustenance by hunting and fishing, teaching them habits of consistent industry necessary to compete in an industrial age, and will furthermore dispel the almost universal Indian opinion of white antagonism that makes the Indian people so difficult to negotiate with. Now, while some of the other researchers, like Lionel Pett, saw nutrition as an alternative explanation for these so-called inherent racial traits of indigenous peoples being invoked by Caldwell, their studies were nonetheless grounded in a related set of racialized assumptions that seem to form the starting point for all investigations into indigenous nutrition conducted during this period. Namely, that malnutrition was the cause of the preconceived so-called racial characteristics that had been used to define the scope of the so-called Indian problem, and that the observed levels of malnutrition tended to be the consequence of the inevitable transition from traditional to so-called modern foods. And the solution, unsurprisingly, always, was more expert intervention, whether through education or through the kinds of nutritional technologies being tested at the experimental schools. Which leads, I think, to the question of ethics. And as it turns out, there's very little evidence in the documentary record as to whether any of these researchers discussed the ethical implications of their work. While I hoped that they would have a letter in which they questioned whether what they were doing was ethical, they probably had those conversations off record. And so when I began to look into this, I tried to figure out the ethical dimensions of what was going on. And while these experiments are without a doubt ethically dubious and hugely problematic by contemporary standards, the reality in the 1940s is that there's actually few, if any, written rules governing the ethics of medical research in Canada, and there was no consistent requirement that research subjects give their informed consent to take part in a medical study. Although the very concept of informed consent was established during this period, that these studies were taking place in the form of the Nuremberg Code of Experimental Research Ethics, the practice was by no means universal. The Nuremberg doctors' trial, pictured here, which involved the prosecution of Nazi doctors for horrific experiments conducted on mostly Jewish prisoners during the Second World War. I went into this assuming that I would find lots of media coverage of the Nuremberg doctors' trial. In fact, I was unable to find even an instance of it being discussed in the Canadian media, and the same is true in the American press. And in fact, according to the historian of medical research ethics, Jay Katz, even scientists who were aware of the Nuremberg trial and the Nuremberg Code, they often viewed it as, quote, a code for barbarians and not for civilized physician investigators. And in fact, when interviewed in May 2000 about the fact that dental treatments were withheld from residential school students as part of his research when this information was first uncovered by the media, Lionel Pett distinguished between his experiment and one that would be considered unethical by arguing that it was, quote, not a deliberate attempt to leave children to develop cavities except for a limited time or place or purpose, and only then to study the effects of vitamin C or fluoride. And so for PET, in other words, the fact that children were already suffering from malnutrition and the effects of inadequate diets prior to the experiments made it ethical to use children as experimental subjects. Now, regardless of whether these studies met the ethical standards at the time, which itself is debatable, and some have argued that, in fact, these even broke the minimal to non-existent ethical rules that existed, it's also clear that they did nothing to address the widely recognized cause of malnutrition identified in the schools, which always boiled down to a lack of proper funding for food service, a lack of proper funding for residential schooling in general. And it also seems clear that the students had no idea they were taking part in an experiment, and that for some, the regular physical examinations that went along, that were administered by the researchers, were often confusing, painful, and for some students, potentially even traumatic. Although the voices of the children themselves are often silent in the official documentary record of the Department of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services, a series of letters sent to Lionel Pett by the students of the Alberni Residential School in 1952 provide some insight into the experience of children. While ostensibly being sent by the students to thank Pett and the researchers for their visits to the school, it's clear from the content of the letters and the similar format of each letter that Lionel Pett actually had asked the teacher to have the students provide a list of all the foods that they weren't getting in residential schools, but that they were looking forward to eating when they got home. And this was part of a larger study. Pett was doing a number of studies at this time. And it was a study he was conducting concurrently with the nutrition experiments that sought to ascertain the long-term effects of the residential school experience on children's diets and eating habits once they left schools. Now the letters are like this one. They all listed a broad range of different foods that the students were looking forward to eating. Both store foods and country foods. And these often include a number of common items like homemade bread, fish eggs. These are mostly Gitsan and New Chalmers students. Fish eggs, duck soup, seaweed, seagull eggs, herring, cherries, and pie. But in addition to these lists, most students also took time to include other messages to the research team. These range from simple statements like, "Thank you for the medical you gave us," to more ominous ones like, "Tell the nurse I said thank you for the poke she gave me." Many of the children, for instance, complained that the nurses wrote down the wrong age on the charts and were upset that they wouldn't change them. One child who complained of having the wrong age recorded also added that she didn't understand the words Dr. Brown was saying. I was listening very carefully too. The same student actually, she lists in her letter specific words that she heard. She kind of transcribes them, and they're very specific to what dentists actually say, like describing different teeth. And so the student was listening very carefully. She was not told what was happening. Many students expressed frustration that no one was listening to them, no one was answering their questions, hence the saying that they wrote down the wrong age. The nurses wouldn't even listen to them when they said, "That's not actually my age." An even more common and troubling theme of the letters was that many children wanted to reassure the doctors that the examinations and tests were not painful. One child, for instance, wrote, quote, "The pokes I got didn't hurt me very much, and I got a couple of my teeth out by the dentist, but it didn't hurt very much when he pulled them out." Now, as I learned, yeah.
So how do you know that the letter from coach?
Oh yeah, there's definitely evidence they can coach. And so these children spoke around the coaching. So for instance, this child wrote that it didn't hurt very much when I got my teeth pulled out. When I visited New Chalmers and Gitsan communities who were part of the, when I talked to survivors, their teeth were being pulled out without anesthetic. And so the statement that it didn't hurt very much when he pulled my teeth out, these were teeth being pulled out of children without anesthetic, speaking to the actual pain of the experience. Another student wrote, yeah.
Earlier you mentioned about consent, where you said subjects didn't consent to any of this, but because there were children
their parents could have consented if they asked them. And later on, they had to start asking parents about what was being done to their children, even when they were in the schools. And children do have the ability to consent themselves. They, especially, at least to be told what's happening to them.
Yeah, I guess the concern for me would be, okay, well, parents are being legally charged for not allowing their children to go to residential schools, so what rights do they really have to say, you can't do those experiments with the kids?
One, I think that's exactly the point of the coercive nature of residential schools. The parents didn't have a choice. The children didn't have a choice. Consent was not even a concept that was considered in residential schools. Yeah. Another student wrote, quote, "Thank you for all the perks you gave us. I hope we're going to be healthy all through the year and not take so many teeth out. We'll all try not to be sick." Now, the fear involved in this clinical interaction was perhaps best captured by a student who wrote, the student with this letter, he wrote, "When the nurse pricked me, it did not hurt me at all, but little part is showing yet. I hope I'm okay." Perhaps tellingly, the same student's letter also included a correction that appeared to have been added afterwards, perhaps by a teacher coaching the student, in which the student's statement thanking the doctors and nurses, quote, "for what they have done to us all," was changed to "for what they have done for us." While many of the students thanked the researchers for coming to help us be well and strong and healthy, it was clear by the end of the study, this is true of many unethical studies done in Indigenous communities on Indigenous peoples, that the benefits were disproportionately skewed towards the professional interests of researchers like Lionel Pett. This is the hallmark of research that continues, I believe, to this day, is that benefits disproportionately go to researchers and not to communities. What's worse, for the children who acted as controls during the study, who received no treatment, or who, like the students at the St. Mary's School in Kenora, who developed iron deficiency anemia during the course of the study because of the intervention of Newfoundland and rich flour, the risk to their own health often far outweighed any possible benefits they might have received. What's more, the fact that the researchers knew that the overall improvements to student health was simply impossible without a substantial increase to the per capita grant provided to schools by the federal government highlights the stark reality that these experiments were only possible in the first place because of an intentionally underfunded residential school student system that was characterized fundamentally by the neglect and abuse of students. And I say intentionally underfunded because it was well known that the schools were underfunded and that children were being harmed because of it, and no changes were made. So this was an intentional system of harm, and that's what made these experiments possible. And in fact, none of these experiments or studies conducted between 1942 and 1952 even had much in the way of scientific value. There's little evidence, for instance, that the experiment started in northern Manitoba was ever finished, but even if it was, they didn't publish the results in a scientific journal. And some of the data collected from the other experiments were presented at conferences or workshops. In one case, it was published in a minor journal. But these had little effect on the science of nutrition. I yet to find any citation of any of the studies. And even more importantly, they didn't seem to have much effect on the operation of food service in the schools. In fact, reports continue to come in regarding poor food service in schools, not including these experiments. In 1953, for instance, Indian Health Services received reports from carpenters working on the Brandon Residential School in Manitoba that children, quote, are not being fed properly to the extent that they're garbaging around in barns for food that should only be fed to barn occupants. And in fact, nearly a decade of experiments and studies of Indigenous diets similarly had little effect on the pre-existing assumptions of federal policymakers and bureaucrats like Lionel Pett and Percy Moore. Both continued to push for the same solutions, for expert-driven technological solutions as a means of easing the so-called transition from traditional to modern diets, as though Indigenous people weren't already modern. And in many ways, such attitudes simply fit within the technocratic and paternalistic ethos of Canada's administration of Indigenous peoples during this period. The 1950s, after all, saw the Department of Northern Affairs and Natural Resources attempt to socially engineer a solution to the so-called Eskimo problem in a number of Inuit communities by experimentally relocating them without their informed consent to unfamiliar and often unforgiving new Arctic settlements. And this has since been well documented by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, among others. The result was not only profound social and cultural dislocation, but in the tragic case of the Aharamut of Anendai Lake, the result was also hunger, starvation, and misery. And the decision to engage in such brazen attempts at social engineering ultimately came from the same mindset that drove Moore, Tisdall, and Pett to conduct their own scientific experiments. As Northern Affairs Executive Officer Robert Phillips wrote in 1955, it was useful for the department to, quote, think of 9,000 Eskimos as laboratory experiment and give the imagination full rein on what might be done to improve the culture. Indigenous peoples, in other words, continue to be seen as experimental materials, and their communities as laboratories for both scientific and social experimentation well after the experiments of Pett, Moore, and Tisdall had ended. The question then is, how do we understand the legacy of these particular experiments conducted in residential schools? For survivors, these revelations seem to have simply confirmed what they long believed about their own experiences. As residential school survivor Leonard Poulos told the Toronto Star, he was alarmed by the revelations he'd been part of a nutrition experiment, but he wasn't surprised. They never treated us as human beings, Poulos told the Star. Even to this day, I'm 67, I'm still haunted by it. The late Alvin Dixon, a survivor of the Alberni residential school, expressed a similar sentiment on CBC's As It Happens, stating the revelations were not a surprise, and they in fact simply affirmed what he'd always believed. That, quote, the federal government and most Canadians don't give a shit what happens to us as First Nations people. They're on our stolen lands, our holy lands, and they're not going to be happy until they have it all. They were trying to eliminate us, so it's not surprising. And these are sentiments that I've spoken around the country that I've heard echoed from other survivors that I met with over the past 3 years, who both in private correspondence and at public events have made it abundantly clear that their experience of residential schools was of abuse, neglect, and near constant hunger. As I've repeated, and I think it's worth repeating, these experiments were only possible because malnutrition was systemic across the country in residential schools. And in fact, poor feeding and malnutrition didn't end when the experiments ended. And in fact, according to testimony of survivors, as well as the final report of the TRC, these conditions often persisted up through the 1960s. The question then becomes not what were the health impacts of the nutrition experiments themselves, which is the question I often get asked, what were the long-term health impacts of the experiments? But in fact, what are the long-term health and psychological impacts of multiple generations of children from the very beginning of the residential school system being malnourished during their formative years, multiple generations of families being malnourished during their formative years? And in fact, according to the most recent research on the long-term impacts of sustained childhood malnutrition, these health impacts include increased risks of a number of conditions that today disproportionately affect Indigenous communities, including conditions like metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. And perhaps what's just as devastating is the schools attempted to forcibly strip multiple generations of children of their food cultures and traditions. So rather than learning during these formative years how to properly harvest, prepare, and eat seasonal, healthy, and sacred foods, many survivors of the residential school system were taught to actively reject the foodways of their communities in favor of a heavily starch-based diet that tended to be provided in the schools. As survivors have told me, it wasn't just that they were forced to consume unfamiliar and often barely edible foods. Food also became a key source of reward and punishment in schools across the country, with many students having their food withheld, often for days at a time, for breaking rules like speaking their own Indigenous languages. And in addition, I heard stories across the country of students being punished by being forced to eat rotten and spoiled food. And so a legacy of this relationship with food that was taught to residential school students, according to the children of some of the survivors I met, are generations of adults who have struggled to overcome the psychological burden of these experiences. The memory of those hard, hungry years has led to some for a fixation on food, as well as a tendency towards overeating and a fear of food waste, which is common to people who have survived famines. Many of the psychological stresses of people who survive residential schools are similar to those who survive famines. And so when you combine this with the heavily unhealthy, starch-based diet that was taught to residential school students, pupils in health and food classes that were included, and that's been made worse over time by the dominance of cheap and unhealthy processed foods on supermarket shelves across the country, I'd argue that the legacy of residential schools lives on in the contemporary diets not only of survivors, but also due to no fault of their own, in the diets of their children and even grandchildren. Another unanswered question I think still remains after, 3 years after these revelations made national headlines, is the question of how many other experiments also took place. Many survivors I've spoken to have told me that the revelations about these experiments only confirm their suspicions that they've been the subjects of medical experimentation in their local communities, in residential schools, in TB sanatoria, and in racially segregated Indian hospitals. And as my presentation today has suggested, the assumptions that made these nutrition experiments possible within both the scientific community and the federal bureaucracy remained in place well after these specific experiments ended. And this has actually been largely confirmed by the final report of the TRC, which outlines another 7 scientific studies found to have taken place between 1940 and 1970. And as you'll note, many of these experiments took place in Saskatchewan schools. And in fact, given that I've been doing historical research on the quote-unquote amebicide experiment at the Onion Lake residential school over the past few months, I can assure you that the mindset of medical researchers doing human experimentation in the 1960s and 1970s is very much similar, if not identical, to those working in the 1940s and 1950s, as was the absence of any ethical oversight over their work. It's also important to note that this isn't a complete list. This list provided by the TRC isn't a complete list of experiments because the TRC's mandate only gave it access to documents related to residential schools and not to other federally operated institutions like TB sanatoria or Indian hospitals. But given that thousands of Indigenous children and adults were patients at these institutions throughout the 20th century, often for years at a time and without their consent, it's hard to believe that medical experimentation would have only happened in schools and not actual medical institutions. And in fact, many former patients and Indigenous employees of Canada's Indian hospital system, a system of racially segregated medical care, they've since gone on record stating that they believe they were subjects of or witnesses to medical studies examining experimental pharmaceuticals and even surgical practices. As Indigenous nurse Michael Dick told historian Lori Meyer-Dries in an interview about his decade of experience working at the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, quote, "Looking back on the stuff they did, I can't prove it in court, but I'm positive that there was experimentation." And there are many, many other such accounts from survivors and employees at these institutions. Historian Maureen Lux's recent book, Separate Beds on the History of the Indian Hospital System, points to similar accounts of experimentation. And in fact, my own research has confirmed this. There's abundant documentary evidence showing that things like clinical drug trials and other experiments were conducted on Indigenous peoples at institutions like the North Battleford Indian Hospital, Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, and even the University Hospital in Saskatoon throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And so perhaps it's therefore time that the federal government and provincial governments like the Saskatchewan government took the concerns of survivors seriously and launched inquiries not just into what happened in residential schools, but also in other federally operated institutions like Indian hospitals, TB sanatoria, and day schools. After all, if the work of the TRC has taught Canadians anything over the past 6 years, it should be that reconciliation is impossible if we don't know the truth, and that finding the truth means that we need to first and foremost start listening to survivors. Thank you.